Fellow conspiracy realists, we have an exciting collaborative classic for you this evening. We're big fans of a show called Stuff to Blow Your Mind, featuring our good friends Robert Lamb and Joe McCormick. We got to tell you, they class up the show every time they drop by. Do you guys remember this one?
I don't know, man. I feel like time kind of stood still while we were making this, and I could see the Matrix a little.
Little flash forward, whatever the opposite of deja vu is.
Some really good sushi recipes in them lines of code.
Oh, wait. Maybe it was the shrooms.
Maybe it was. We know that there is a renaissance in recent years with psychedelic research, especially in processing trauma or PTSD. And back in 2019, we had Robert over to explore kind of the smoke and mirrors, the hype versus the fact versus the fiction of psychedelics. And this was just such a rewarding and bizarre conversation.
Indeed. Let's jump right into said rewarding conversation about psilocybin and psychedelic experiences.
From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. A production of iHeartRadio's How Stuff Works.
Hello, welcome back to the show. My name is Matt.
My name is Noel.
They call me Ben. We are joined, as always, with our super producer, Paul Mission Control Deccan. Most importantly, you are here, and that makes this stuff they don't want you to know. Today, we've got to welcome you back, Noel. You've been on some trips recently. You have not been tripping necessarily.
Well, you don't know that.
I don't. I just said necessarily. Necessarily means I'm not saying you had to.
Nor deny. I was in San Francisco for a little while. That would have been a good opportunity to do that, but it did not cross my path.
And today's episode, for anyone who didn't bother to read the title, you were so excited you just jumped in. Today's episode is about tripping. It's about psychedelics, hallucinogens.
One in particular. And in the past, we've talked a little more broadly about hallucinogens and psychedelics. In our episodes, avid listeners would remember, did hallucinogens create religion? Or can hallucinogens cure addiction? But today we're drilling down into one specific substance, and we've brought someone along with us to help.
That's right. We are not diving into this rabbit hole alone. Please welcome to the show our good friend, co-host of Stuff to Blow Your Mind, co-host of Invention, Mr. Robert Lamb.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're very excited that you're here, Robert. We very much are looking to you as an expert, because you not long ago completed I believe, 5-part series on this very substance, on Stuff to Blow Your Mind.
Yeah, me and my co-host, Joe McCormick, we did a 5-part look at psilocybin, and psychedelics in general, but with a very much of a focus on psilocybin.
It's an interesting time for that, especially because I think the tide is sort of turning in terms of not only public opinion, but even just the laws surrounding it. It's getting loosened up in a lot of places, and there's legitimate research being done using psilocybin to treat things like depression or anxiety or what have you.
Yeah, I think the research area is perhaps the most exciting area to look at, because there was a lot of progress made back in the 50s and 60s. And then, of course, things died down almost to a trickle, to a crawl for decades. And now we're living in a true renaissance of psychedelic research, where researchers have picked up where others left off and are continuing to really explore the healing potential of these substances.
Yeah, and a lot of this has to do with the social mores, right? The way substances and certain drugs have been viewed over the course of history, right? But before we get too deep into this, let's talk about what we're talking about. What is psilocybin?
Okay, well, psilocybin, for starters, is a psychedelic. And, the term itself is from the Greek words for soul or mind and manifesting. But in particular, psilocybin is a tryptamine psychedelic. It naturally occurs in some 200 different varieties of mushroom. And the primary compounds responsible for its psychedelic effects are psilocybin and psilocin, which ultimately amount to pretty much the same thing since psilocybin breaks down into psilocin inside the body. Compared to almost all other known drugs, psilocybin has an exceptionally low potential for abuse and exceptionally few known physiological risks.
Right. It turns out that many of the urban legends people have heard about folks taking magic mushrooms and then going completely insane for the rest of their lives are just that, urban legends. There are also, I believe, no proven fatalities due to this substance.
Well, I guess two things are worth pointing out. Like, for starters, a certain segment of the population can experience psychological ramifications.
Sure.
So people with a predisposition for, say, schizophrenia, and that's something that everyone should always keep in mind. On the other hand, they are powerful substances. They're not, it's not bubble gum. Set and setting are extremely important. The mental state that one has going into using these substances is extremely important. And so therefore, it's very possible for, especially as a young person who hasn't say put a lot of thought into what is going to happen, it's very possible for them to have a challenging time.
I guess the thing I'm clarifying here is, while all of that is true, there has also been this persistent public image of psilocybin or hallucinogens in general as something that someone would ingest at one point in their lives, and then for the rest of the natural span of their life, they would be functionally insane or unwell or unable to perform as a regular member of society. And I think that's fake. That's propaganda, right? That's negative PR in the war on drugs.
And speaking of PR, just really quickly, we're not, as we do with any ideas we discuss, not saying you should believe this or this is something you should go out and do, or saying you should go out and microdose and take psilocybin today. It'll improve your life. We're just going through some of the effects, some of the history, and some of the current research and the news behind it. And speaking of that, there was a study that just came out from Global Drug Survey, to your point, Ben, that polled close to 120,000 people in 50 different countries about their drug and alcohol consumption. And 12,000 people in that survey said they did mushrooms in 2016, and only 0.2% of them said they needed emergency medical care afterward, as opposed to, that was 5 or 6 times lower than LSD, cocaine, MDMA, and alcohol, and 3 times lower than marijuana. So,
and there's also something to be said here about combination of substances.
Sure.
When you do those, there's always a danger there.
Someone could die being in an unsafe setting or a situation, right?
Yes.
That caused them to behave erratically.
Oh, absolutely. And just to kind of harp one last time on this point that that everybody's kind of making here.
Sure.
There is a small segment of the population that should never try psilocybin, but for the overwhelming majority, it is not something that's going to cause deleterious effects, right?
Yeah, one more statistic here. It looks like about 8% of the U.S. population, counting people over 26, 8% of people over 26 years old have at least self-reported using some sort of hallucinogen. Is that number higher in actuality? Maybe, but not that much. So again, this war on drugs mentality doesn't really track. It is not as if 1 out of 3 people on the street are tripping their balls off or something. Yeah. You know what I mean? And and to Robert's point, it's not something. Well, historically, psychedelics played a more formal role in human experience, or a more spiritual role, rather than a recreational role.
100%. And that's, I think, in terms of the tide turning, it's starting to be seen more like that instead of just some thing that you pop for jollies at a concert or something like that,
This is something that fascinated me about your discussion on Stuff to Blow Your Mind, Robert. When we get to the nuts and bolts of psilocybin specifically, how much do we know about how it actually works in the human brain?
Yeah, well, we still don't know for sure the exact neurochemical mechanism, but classic psychedelics appear to bind to a specific subclass of serotonin receptor, the serotonin 2A receptor. And these receptors are found concentrated in the human cortex, which is the outer layer of the cerebellum, which is associated with a lot of higher brain functions, sensation, speech, of course, language, voluntary action. So when you take a psychedelic like LSD or psilocybin, mushrooms, the active ingredient, the active compounds make their way into the brain and sort of act as serotonin, binding to these receptors. But yeah, there are a lot of questions that still remain, about exactly how it works. So a lot of questions remain exactly regarding how serotonin really works in our minds.
Well, and there are a lot of stories that are a little more anecdotal about, or I guess let's say tales of what psilocybin actually is and how it functions within the body outside of the medical research, right? About it being conscious in some way. I mean, there are all kinds of things we can get into a little later in here. I mean, there are stories that you will find across the internet and perhaps hear from acquaintances of yours that go a little deeper into the strangeness.
But let's imagine that there was like a big pharma type commercial for psilocybin, and let's think about what would be rattled off at the end, the things that could be caused. Things like nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, muscle relaxation, weakness and twitches, yawning, drowsiness, dizziness, lightheadedness, and lack of coordination, pupil dilation, tearing, dry mouth, and facial flushing, increased heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, sweating followed by chills and shivering, numbness of tongue, lips, or mouth, feeling of physical heaviness or lightness, and feeling of floating.
Yeah, and I was just reading the other day about how DARPA is interested in basically harnessing all of this without the mind-altering aspects.
Just to weaponize it, essentially, right? DARPA, our eternal fourth co-host, So there's another thing here when we're dwelling on the anecdotal stuff. We do have to say that this very quickly gets us into some of the more out there or fringe concepts, beliefs, authors, and before we get to those ideas, which are grand, and many are as beautiful as they are unprovable, but they're all based on not so much the physical sensations people encounter, but the psychological situations they encounter. And this, I think, Matt, is directly tying into some of the anecdotes you've mentioned. Everybody has a lot of people who try hallucinogens have this kind of hero's journey tale, right? And sometimes it's full of Jungian archetypes. Sometimes it's just full of strange perceptions of time and space, or even synesthesia.
Things much less easy to quantify in a rattled off list at rapid fire at the end of a television commercial.
Yeah, I mean, the ineffable aspect of it is always a key factor. Michael Pollan has an excellent book that came out this year about psychedelics called How to Change Your Mind, which I recommend to everybody. Just a wonderful read. But in an interview with Terry Gross, he mentioned that William James once said that the mystical experience of psychedelics is ineffable, yet we try very hard to F it.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big thing to keep in mind with the subjective experiences of psychedelics. Is that first of all, it's highly susceptible to set and setting. Mm-hmm. It's highly susceptible to your mindset going into it. Therefore, it's also highly susceptible to stories you've heard about the use of psychedelics, be it inspiring tales from various psychonauts, mm-hmm. or the scare tactics of the moral panic and the war on drugs that popped mm-hmm. up in the wake of the counterculture. And then after we've had those experiences, we of course have memories of those experiences, and memories are highly susceptible to us then tinkering with them as we turn them into narrative.
I'm sorry for anyone who can't see, because this is an audio podcast. When you said that, Robert, I had to point across the table because yes, memory is a treacherous territory, right? It's a domain where you cannot really trust the geography you encounter. And I want to go back to hallucinogens in general. I think growing up, at least here in the West, many children when they encounter the idea of hallucinogens, they encounter a very fictionalized representation of this, right? Somebody ingest something. Maybe Alice in Wonderland would be a good example.
Yeah, it would.
Somebody ingests something, and then their concept of time and space changes, right? Or size, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they begin to see visibly strange creatures, right? The white rabbits and so on. But is that nonsense? Is that true? When people take psilocybin, are they seeing visual entities? Or it seems like there's a lot of malarkey about hallucination out there. So what's the fact? What's the fiction?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of the malarkey does come from media representations of it. And part of that is that it's difficult to capture the psychedelic experience in a fictional medium, be it a book, certainly in a movie. And then so a lot of the examples we have, they're gonna be more like a dream sequence. They're going to, they might not be that well executed, and they're also probably going to play into something that's more dramatic, right? Maybe even something more horrific as a means of just advancing whatever story they're telling.
Do you guys remember the book Go Ask Alice?
No.
So it was a 1971 fictional book for young adults written anonymously. And at the time, like when I was a kid, it was a required book we had to read. And it's basically the story of this young girl who starts taking drugs and ultimately takes psychedelics and ends up like throwing herself off a building and like dying. And it's now looked at as utter propaganda, but I was forced to read it, and it was in the era of Dare, where they come through the school with like a giant suitcase full of every drug and point it out and tell you all about it and all of these horror stories. But I got to say, the giant suitcase of drugs, just as a kid, I'm like, ooh, I want to try that one and that one and that one.
Well, it makes you think of Hunter S. Thompson.
Exactly,
right?
Of course.
Which of course, the book and certainly the movie are, I think for a lot of people, are kind of like their first, or at least an early introduction into what like the psychedelic experience might consist of. And yet at the same time, that movie's completely ridiculous.
Of course, of course.
Depiction of things, like, I mean, it's wonderful, but it's a highly, it highly depends on depictions of hallucination. That's right. Outright visual hallucination.
The Las Vegas movie?
Yes.
Bat Country, yes, yeah, just so. And this is interesting, though, especially the point about Hunter S. Thompson, because while that is still very much gonzo, right, very much his genre, there are true events there that form the kernel of this. So we are reading, what do they always say? A made-for-TV movie is more or less BS when that little card comes up at the front of the show and it says, inspired by true events. They're inspired by actual events. So we can say then that a lot of Hunter S. Thompson's work was inspired by true events, if not, with a lot of poetic license, but there's still a factual account. And if we look back through the canon, Hunter S. Thompson, Go Ask Alice, various shamanic experiences, we see that people have been writing about this stuff for a very, very long time and have been doing it since before we figured out how to write things, right?
Yeah. I mean, really, you look at so many ancient cultures, and it's difficult to find an example of one where there's not a case or a strong case or a definite case to be made for hallucinogenics playing psychedelics playing some sort of role in their society. I mean, it was part of shamanistic practices, and still remains a part of shamanistic practices in certain parts of the world.
I'd just like to jump back really fast to the Maryland Center physiological effects of ingesting psilocybin, because I think there are a couple in here that speak directly to what we're talking about that are the reason that this type of substance is used in shamanistic practices and has been for so long. Just very, very specifically, the heightened sensory perceptions that can occur.
And that's probably the one DARPA is most interested in.
Oh, yeah, exactly. The time and space being altered, like the feelings of time and space being altered, right? As well as the detachment from the self, from the body, basically the third personing that can occur with these substances. And it's those three combined become such a potent avenue to explore, I guess, your own consciousness or the feelings that you're having within that moment, and the single person's connection to the greater universe or nature or the spirit, whatever is being worshipped. You can really see it as a potent tool.
And it doesn't have to be even that lofty. It could be something as simple as your connection to something like television, the concept of like watching television and what that means and how you interact with something like that and don't even think about what it is. Under the influence of something like this, you might see it completely different and question how much time you spend with this box watching other people doing things on TV. And your relationship that might seem very normal otherwise, all of a sudden you start to question it and be like, why am I doing this? Why am I putting so much emphasis on this experience?
I like that you mentioned that because there are some studies that indicate, if not necessarily psilocybin, some hallucinogens are very helpful with people who are struggling with habits or addictions, right? Anything from smoking to I imagine, I haven't seen a study on it, but I imagine what if there's someone who watches too much TV?
Sure,
and they're like, drop this, now watch this marathon of Seinfeld.
It's just associations in general, right?
Sure.
Like the idea, let's say I'm addicted to cigarettes. In my mind, this is a steadfast part of who I am. Under the influence of psychedelics, you might be able to take a step back and see it as something that you can just very easily cast off or take or leave,
So there's a high-level look at the nuts and bolts of psilocybin in specific, some of the history, some of the current research, and, I think a pretty accurate look at the controversy and the mechanics of the experience, right? But what if there is more to the story? What if there is something beyond the psychological effects that compels our species and has compelled it for thousands of years to pursue these hallucinogenic experiences? Here's where it gets crazy. There's this author named Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna was born in 1946, and if you are familiar with characters such as Timothy Leary, if you are familiar with the revolution of hallucinogens, right, through the 60s into the 70s and so on, then you have heard this name before. You may have read books like Food of the Gods, The Search for the Original Tree of Knowledge, and shout out to my friend Henry if you're listening, because this is the part of the episode that I think you will find incredibly fascinating. This guy is a friend of ours, will sometimes write to me and try to get us to do another psychedelic episode. So you're helping us very much, Robert, because you've read some Terence McKenna, right?
Yeah, I've been on something of a Terence McKenna kick recently, and McKenna is a fascinating individual, a wonderful writer, wonderful speaker too. There's no shortage of YouTube streams and whatnot available out there. You can listen to him present his ideas to people. I think it's fair to compare him to Timothy Leary in a sense, like in kind of a way he was kind of filling that the void, filling that the place for a spokesperson for the psychedelic experience in the counterculture, especially during the 1990s. But he also, I think, in many respects, is felt more authentic than Leary. Leary is also a fascinating individual who certainly said some profound things and played a powerful role in the counterculture. At the same time, had plenty of faults to go around as well.
Yes.
And definitely like leaned into the sort of guru nature that was given to him. But McKenna is fascinating from a number of standpoints. Certainly his commentary on psychedelics, but he also wrote and spoke about various aspects of the human experience.
Mm-hmm. This name may be unfamiliar to some of us listening today, but you may have already encountered some of his ideas, right? Because when we talk about a hallucinogenic psychedelic experience, we're humans, right? Our brains are built to kind of categorize and group things. And so it's no surprise that, similar to reports of near-death experiences, some hallucinogens and some people's experience using them appear to have trends. And that's when you'll hear people tell you with complete conviction that they have not only gone to a new realm of consciousness, but they encountered something there when they took the substance, right?
And the big question for me here when we're discussing something like this is if you are going to go down that route of there is a shared experience in some way when using these substances, is it a shared thing with the humans and our biological systems and the history of our biological systems, or is it something with the substance itself that is either unlocking something within us or is imparting something? Which is always an interesting
sort of the idea of like a collective unconsciousness that people are unconscious people are tapping into, kind of. Or?
Yeah, and I think a big part of it comes back to what we do believe that psychedelics are doing.
Right.
A basic one of the analogies I love is the shaking of the snow globe, shaking things up, changing your perspective, putting you in a mindset that could enable you to overcome various addictions. Again, that's one of the areas where we see some wonderful research results. But again, it's not the psychedelic substances themselves that are treating or could be used to treat addictions, but it is the state that they invoke, the psychedelic experience itself, and so. If you're put in a state where suddenly you're seeing everything from new perspectives, it can certainly put you in a state where you can have some rather almost alien interpretations of what's going on inside your brain and what's going on inside reality.
And really quick, as far as the research, do you know? We can look this up if no one does. Is there any study that goes into does it change your brain on a physiological level, or is it more about
permanent level?
Yeah, or is it more about you remembering the experience and applying that to your life in terms of using it as treatment, or in terms of the lasting impact of an experience like this?
Unless I'm forgetting a key study, I don't believe there are any studies that point to fixed changes in the structure of the brain.
I wouldn't have thought so either. Yeah. To me, it seems more like I'm learning. I'm having a session where I'm experiencing something, and then I'm remembering that. It doesn't require you to repeat the experience over and over again. You can just do it a handful of times in the same way you can go to therapy. You don't have to be in therapy 24/7. You go occasionally and you learn from that, and you take your experiences and apply them to your life.
Yeah, it's not going to change your DNA, which I think there were some
Graham Hitchcock
stories about that back in the day. But yeah, I think it comes back to the idea that they are physiologically rather benign, but psychologically powerful, and that's where the impact is.
I did see a study about some hallucinogen. I think it was the psychedelic drugs, LSD and ecstasy, not mushrooms. And
now, technically, MDMA is not a psychedelic.
Right. I think they grouped it specifically LSD, and then they also studied ecstasy or MDMA, and they found that there can be some physical alteration of the brain. But to these researchers, let's see, who was this? This is David Olson, who's an assistant professor of chemistry and molecular medicine at UC Davis. What they found seemed to be potentially beneficial rather than something damaging. They thought it could have benefits for people with certain mood disorders. But I haven't seen a ton of the research that would indicate, what you're talking about, Noel, some kind of massive system-wide physical change in the brain. I think part of that is because our research was stymied for so long, right, due to some of the social concerns and taboos mentioned earlier. And that's why some of these concepts that are still so very, very out there, the idea that accidental ingestion and then later purposeful ingestion of hallucinogenic materials led to religion, right? Or what's the other one? It's the Terence McKenna.
We talked about the stoned ape theory.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, the stoned ape hypothesis, which is a fabulous, a very entertaining hypothesis. And his book, Food of the Gods, is really I found it a really rewarding read.
Tell us a bit about that, because this goes into those the heightened sensory perception that we talked about.
That's one of the keys. So he makes this argument that human consciousness emerges in large part due to the consumption of psychedelics by our prehistoric ancestors. And the case he makes is incomplete. It's there's no way to prove it, and maybe no way to really disprove it. But he points to heightened perception, which I believe there's been a recent study with canines or canines or wolves, I forget which, that show like a similar situation, like enhancing their ability to, in the case of dogs, to find their food. In the case of hunter-gatherers, it could have had an effect there. McKenna also made an argument for enhancing the libido, leading to to more breeding, and then just sort of an evolution of thought and the rise of language and so forth. And then he plays a lot too with looking at where this would have occurred and how it would have occurred, what substances might have occurred, while at the same time acknowledging that it was written during the dark age of psychedelic research, that there were still a lot of questions remaining, and certain archaeological finds he said would need to be made to fully support his case.
And that's one thing that gives him a ton of street cred, in my opinion, is being able to say, okay, also we have to, wait for proof.
Yeah.
I think this is possible, but let's wait till we see the bones. One of the biggest walkaways I have whenever I read some McKenna stuff is I'll say, all right, this is very far away from what maybe the mainstream thinks, right? Certainly it's far away from what the U.S. federal government officially thinks about psychedelics. However, you read stuff like that and you go back to medieval texts that some really probably intoxicated monks have been working on, and then you see this strange art and you think, okay, it's plausible. Maybe more people were using psychedelics than we thought, right? And the symbolism, right, in Mesoamerica, right?
Yeah.
And I think we mentioned 2 various different manuscripts seem to have what appears to be mushrooms of some sort playing these incredibly important, significant symbolic roles.
A really quick diversion. I think this applies, though. I've been reading this book called Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, and it's the idea of the evolution of man. And I didn't realize that a lot of Homo sapiens species existed on the planet at the same time. You have this sense of there being this this graph of the slumped over pre-man developing into the upright man, but apparently all of these kind of developed at the same time. And it was Homo sapiens' ability to develop language and be able to tell stories and almost create these sort of belief systems that led to us becoming the top of the food chain. That's sort of the hypothesis in this book, and it makes a lot of sense. And to me, maybe the ape that ate the psychedelic mushroom and kind of had his perception change would have been the one that started to develop language or create these more abstract ideas of storytelling. And it's something as simple as me telling you a sort of fictional tale about some animals interacting to inventing something like an LLC, like a corporation, or like the idea of money that's all just kind of fictions that we believe and we accept. But that's what separates us from other species that can only say the dog is over there, but they can't say, the dog talked to the cat and you create this narrative surrounding that or whatever.
The dog is over there because that is the way to access the afterlife.
Yeah, exactly.
You guys, it's because they accessed the overmind.
Right.
They got down into the mycelial connections.
Yeah.
They figured out, it's all one big thing, you guys, and we're just a part of it.
And I get the stoned ape thing is very unprovable, but I think I'm on the same page with you, Robert, that it's fascinating, and I can kind of see how that could be a leg up.
Yeah, I'm not really into saying it's the thing.
Sure.
But I think you can certainly make a case that any substance or event or experience that causes a person to sort of step outside of their normal way of thinking.
Yeah.
And that can be anything. It could be psilocybin. It could be trauma. It could be a sickness. There are numerous things that can bring on these states. Those would undoubtedly have effects on the course of human culture over time, just because they would be moments where people would stop and say, why are we doing it this way? Why am I thinking about the world this way? what if we did it like this instead?
Isn't tradition just peer pressure from dead people? Come on, guys. The sun will rise whether or not we sacrifice someone. That's be very glib there. I do want to point out, though, while Harari is an excellent writer, Sapiens toward the end feels a lot more speculative, and it feels like more of his opinions and his beliefs. And that's something we run into with McKenna. Both of these authors, however, I believe are careful to couch things as their beliefs, right? Like you said, they're not necessarily saying this is the way, this is the 100% consistent experience people have, but we do see some trends, and some of those trends are inarguable and they are easily proven, such as the spiritual use of these substances to sometimes unite communities, right? Somebody goes maybe sometimes to change someone's place in a society, right? You have undergone this rite, this ritual, therefore you are a holy person, or maybe you are now an adult, something like that. And then also there's this connection to the concept of the other world, the dream world, right? And I wonder how that translates to the modern day. We know that there's still some traditional use of hallucinogens, like ayahuasca, right, is still traditionally used by several different communities. But are there other things? Are there modern analogs? I mean, I guess part of the question is, when people go to Burning Man, right, and they take a hallucinogenic substance, are they doing something similar to the shamanistic quest, or is it just recreational? I don't know. That's also a very personal question. Like, how has our use of these substances changed?
Well, I think McKenna would have certainly agreed that like Burning Man is part of like this bohemian thread that he called it, this thing that's moving us towards an archaic revival, return to, especially in Western civilization, to sort of almost a Neolithic state of not really technology or culture, but our connection with each other and our connection with nature. That being said, yeah, I'm sure there are people at Burning Man who are just taking substances without a lot of forethought and doing it just for entertainment purposes, if you will. And then there are people who are having profound experiences and setting out to have profound experiences.
Another big psychonaut, I guess, who is still very much active today is Alex Gray, who I know you're a fan of. He's an incredible...
Oh, yeah, he was at Burning Man.
Yeah, he's a visual artist. He does these... I don't know how you describe them. They're almost these mandala-esque, kind of where the flesh is stripped away of figures. A lot of times there's sort of mother and child kind of imagery, and it's very much this idea of us as being the soul. And we haven't really talked about that aspect of the psychedelic experience, but I'd like to. But he has been associated with the band Tool for years, doing art for them, and they did like a listening party for this new Tool record that came out on this giant dragon, like Mad Max looking dragon boat truck thing. I don't know what you call it, but he's a guy who, it's so funny, like Terrence McKenna, very funny sounding guy. His voice, the way he speaks, Alex Gray sounds very similar. I wonder if there's something about the fact that they've been using these substances so frequently that causes them to almost become a certain way. It's very interesting.
I don't know about that.
Well, I don't know.
We really can't know, though. I mean, we won't know until there's an opportunity to do a longitudinal study.
Absolutely. And I'm not making fun or light at all. They just both have a very similar way that they speak and a way that they kind of carry themselves. And I don't know. I only just heard Alex Gray speak like the other day, and I was like, he sounds just like Terrence McKenna.
Well, maybe to a certain extent, but Terrence definitely had a real knack for speaking and a way of stressing certain words that would come out of his mouth. Like he had a wonderful cadence.
Yeah.
Again, he's all over YouTube, so you can find various talks from
He's
him.
on a Tool song, I believe. Third Eye, isn't there a sample of
I
He's
think
done
that's
a ton
Leary.
of stuff.
But he does show up in some. I've heard some electronic tracks. There's actually an artist by the name of We Plants or Happy Plants, and they have an album that has an extended sample from McKenna that's really cool. And I think that artist also did a full length sort of documentary that's available just for free on YouTube.
Yeah,
wow.
DJs love sampling Terrence McKenna because, again, he has such this vast catalog of recorded speeches and monologues. And also, I mentioned the longitudinal study, not to whoosh on a joke, but to return to one of the things you said at the very top of the show today, Robert. You talked about this renaissance, right? In which we are currently living. We're recording this during a renaissance of research into psychedelics, into psilocybin, but we can't have a renaissance unless it is preceded by some sort of dark age. And and that's why we call these things a renaissance. So we know that during the 70s and 80s, there was intense, and to the 90s as well, there was an intense push by Uncle Sam to make sure people were aware of at least the U.S. legal opinion of psychedelics, which was that they were up any dare kid can tell you, they were up there with heroin, with crack, and things like that.
Yeah, they're Schedule 1 still in most places.
And it's funny they call it Schedule 1. You know what I mean? Like, when does the train leave? I don't know. That's confusing when you're a child.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's complete nonsense, obviously. I mean,
Sure.
Schedule 1 means that there's supposed to have no medical properties at all. And yet, so you have psilocybin Schedule 1, marijuana Schedule 1, cocaine Schedule 2.
Yep.
I feel like that says something.
Dentists use cocaine.
Yeah, I feel like that says something about the people who made the list. And someone's like, I don't know, man. You know, if I need a little extra kick before the meeting, cocaine is Schedule 2. It's as flawed as the food pyramid, honestly. But now we see these indications that we've been sort of foreshadowing and talking about during the length of today's show, which are research forays or pushes into things like treating addiction, PTSD, right? Could you tell us a little bit about, I don't want to enter into speculation, but could you tell us a little bit about what possibilities people are seeing out there for the future of humanity's relationship to psychedelics, as well as the potential findings or research trends we might see in the future?
Well, I'd say the big research trends are, of course, the treatment of various addictions. And a lot of that's going back, like one of the real precursors to that was like pre-1970s studies that looked at its usefulness to treat alcoholism. Specifically, they were using LSD because that's what was available back then. And now most of the studies are using psilocybin because it is more readily available. It is less made taboo by the 1960s.
It's also less long acting.
Yeah, you can do it without the doctors having to babysit people for an extended period of time. People can go home in the evening. But we're seeing a lot of advancements in the treatment of various addictions, but also the treatment of end-of-life anxiety and cancer depression.
That to me is huge, because if we can imagine long-term in the world using a substance like this to make people just almost, if it's just a thing that occurs from some point moving forward where people are just okay, satisfied with the life that they've lived, no matter, what good or terrible things have occurred within that life, but they're satisfied that the end is coming, and it is, either not the end, not fully the end because of the way this substance is making me feel, or that I'm going to be recombined in some way with the universe. Mm-hmm. Just having those positive feelings towards the ends of life for everyone could be an incredible thing for, I think, humanity.
I think it just, again, it's all about reframing an experience. It's less about, everything's going to be okay because I see a beautiful light and I'm going to quote unquote heaven or some kind of beyond or universe connective thing. To me, it's like in the same way that psychedelics could reframe your thinking about smoking cigarettes, it could also reframe your thinking about death.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important part.
And it's something we didn't really touch on earlier, but it's very important, I think, to make make it clear that there is this whole dichotomy of like bad trip, good trip is kind of nonsense. Like essentially, any report you look at, any serious study, people are going to have a mix. They're going to have challenging moments, and they're going to have rewarding moments, and that is part of shaking up the snow globe. Is that it's going to put things in a new context. It may put your fear in a new context, but it also may put some of the things you hold very dear in a new context and force you to analyze them.
I think at its most powerful, one of the analogs anecdotally for this kind of experience, at least the more positive end of it, is the revelation that many astronauts or cosmonauts report when they see the planet by itself for the first time, and they return back to Earth, hopefully safely, and nothing has physiologically changed in their brain, right? Nothing other than the clearly traumatic experience of having to exist in space. Nothing other than that has changed them. They literally just saw something, and they had this moment that psychologically sent them to a different place, and that's where they've stayed. And so when we see people having, tremendously powerful, whether for the good or the ill, experiences on hallucinogens, we have to understand that even if the brain cells don't stay, and even if memory does consistently erode and shift every time you're not looking directly at it, that there is a value to that. Mm-hmm. And I have to wonder, when did the needle begin to swing away from, this stuff being forbidden into this stuff being, I wouldn't say accepted, because numbers of usage statistics are still really low, but I would say it's increasingly going to the mainstream, especially, we've got a lot of Silicon Valley elites who are very much on board with hallucinogens, not just at Burning Man. Right? Mm-hmm. And I think we see these people as successful individuals, and these are modern days. So now there seems to be this logical, I'm tracing it to Silicon Valley, but that's very cocktail napkin math, Now there seems to be this psychological association that says one can be successful and use psychedelics.
Well, think about this. Like, what if you combined use of psilocybin with a therapist who is very versed in that? In the same way you might have a shaman or somebody in a ritualistic experience guiding you, through this experience. What if you could combine, we haven't even talked about microdosing, the idea of taking small amounts of hallucinogens that can have less of a hallucinogenic effect and more of just a changing your base level kind of effect. Mm-hmm. But I love the potential for pushing this into the mainstream even more. Like going to a therapist who is very well versed in hallucinogenic experiences, and you can dose and then have your session where they may be in the same as a guided meditation or a dream, reversion or what have you. I think there's a lot of potential for that we haven't seen yet.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going on in the underground. Due to the legality, that's where it is. Michael Pollan talks about this in his book a little bit, where he actually shops around for the right people to go to have this experience, because he wants an experience on par with the sort of the clinical therapeutic experiences that are taking place in these studies. And he finds some people that seemed a little shifty, but then found some people that seemed like they would be very promising and had a profound experience. But yeah, I would love to see that sort of thing coming. It's coming back into the world, but coming into Western civilization really for the first time.
Well, and you may be in luck, Robert, because there's this guy named Christian Augermeyer, I believe is Angermeyer.
Angermeyer, yeah.
Yeah, he's a very wealthy individual, and he's got some very powerful friends who are also extremely wealthy.
Oh, I always trust people like that.
That's the main thing, right?
Well, he has means, right? Mm-hmm. And he has an idea, because he had a personal experience with psychedelics that he says, quote, was the single most meaningful thing I've ever done or experienced in my life. Nothing has ever come close to it. He wants to, or at least he's expressed that he wants to commercialize in some way, or at least mainstream psychedelics, and in particular psilocybin, in some way maybe like you're talking about, maybe just more of products, who knows? But it looks as though he's on the route to make those things happen as the legality changes.
route.
Now, I don't think we said this. It was just made legal in Colorado?
It was decriminalized, right?
Decriminalized.
Are you sure?
Maybe it was made
I
legal.
thought it was recreationally passed somewhere.
Okay. I know it's decriminalized in Colorado. It's, I think, Oakland, California, like the single place of Oakland, California.
There are still, I mean, there are some very strict laws definitely still in place all over the country. I mean, even when you get down to the plant itself, I mean, the plants themselves, but in this case, the fungus itself, the spores are particularly highly illegal in California and in Georgia, where we're recording this.
Because they're easy to transport too, right? So it's not like you're hauling around a huge marijuana plant, right? It's much easier. And yes,
but not to make the most like obvious like hippie statement ever, but just how ridiculous is it that certain plants are outlawed by the ascendant apes that have destroyed most of the planet?
It's true. It's true.
that use them to gain their prominence over the planet.
And perhaps making them illegal is actually preventing them from being a victim of this great extinction in which we live. I'm spitballing there. Now in Colorado, just in case anybody's outside of Denver and thinking, "Oh, great, we do have to let you know, mushrooms of this sort are decriminalized in Denver."
That's right.
They're still illegal in Colorado, and they're still illegal in Denver.
And they're still illegal in the United States.
Yeah, if you were listening to this podcast, chances are you were somewhere where mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms are quite illegal.
And
so be careful.
If you're somewhere where they're legal, let us know. What are you doing this week? Do you want to hang out? Speaking of hanging out, Robert, thank you so much for taking this journey with us today. A lot of our listeners right now are going, "But you didn't get to this. You didn't get to this. What else is there?" We have some good news because as the co-host of Stuff to Blow Your Mind, you and Joe McCormick, who appeared earlier in an episode of Stuff That I Want You to Know, have done a deep dive into psychedelics. Where can people find this 5-part series?
So we did the 5-part series on psychedelics. You can find it at stufftoblowyourmind.com or just wherever you get your podcasts. You just look up Stuff to Blow Your Mind, and there it is. I do have to say, even though we took a deep dive, we were not able to explore everything either. It is you could do an entire series on psychedelics, on even particular psychedelics, and there's still again so much that we don't know and are figuring out.
And it's a story that changes day to day, too, with now, especially now that the doors have been kind of blown open with this renaissance, as you describe it, with this research. The sky's kind of the limit. And it does feel like the tide is turning, if a little bit slowly, as things tend to do in the law. Yeah,
I mean, right now, the research is very promising. Hopefully, we'll see rescheduling in the future. I've heard that there's a serious possibility that MDMA will be rescheduled in the near future due to therapeutic advancements that are being made with it. And in terms of the future with psychedelics, I mean, there are, of course, so many questions, like who controls it then? Is it Silicon Valley bros? Is it the pharmaceutical industry? Does it remain kind of an essential part of the underground?
Of course it won't be that. I mean, someone's going to commodify it. Someone, you know what I mean? I don't know. I hate to be negative. But I will say, I was reading in one of these articles about some of the studies. Another drug that has been associated with sort of club culture, ketamine, is being used in very, very high-level clinical trials for treating treatment-resistant depression.
Also very controlled medical trials.
A friend of mine in New York City is participating, and you get a drip of ketamine that is a very, very, purposeful dose, and you are monitored, and he said it's working like crazy. So it's interesting to see some of these things that we've associated with, unfairly even maligned substances that are starting to be kind of like taken a little more seriously.
Well, I think it comes back to the idea of change, that like these are substances that when used properly can induce positive change in individuals And if they can make those changes in individuals, then perhaps they can make those changes in the culture as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons that people have such hope for them. That's one of the reasons that the establishment was so fearful of them. And hopefully our future will be defined more by hope than fear. That's what I'm hoping for.
Well said. Well said. And that's our classic episode for this evening. We can't wait to hear your thoughts.
That's right. Let us know what you think. You can reach us at the handle Conspiracy Stuff, where we exist on Facebook, X, and YouTube. On Instagram and TikTok, we're Conspiracy Stuff Show.
If you want to call us, dial 1-833-STDWYTK. That's our voicemail system. You've got 3 minutes. Give yourself a cool nickname and let us know if we can use your name and message on the air. If you got more to say than can fit in that voicemail, why not instead send us a good old-fashioned email? We are
the entities that read every single piece of correspondence we receive. Be aware, yet not afraid. Sometimes the void writes back. Conspiracy@iHeartRadio.com.
Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.